Going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you're all having yourselves a wonderful day. We're gonna be jumping back into some Kaiserreich Universe documentary by Kaiserreich Cinema here. We're gonna be going into episode 7. This one's called Crown and Crescent. It's gonna be going over the Ottoman Empire, Middle East, Balkans, and Bulgaria. This is the longest episode in this series so far, at almost an hour and a half long. And the last one had a ton of information in it going over Austria-Hungary and all the kind of the sub-states that made up that faction. So I'm assuming this is going to be a plethora of information as well with all of these different factions in here. So looking forward to getting into it and seeing how the timeline has affected them and how things have changed for them. So links as always down below in the description to the original video without my commentary and reaction and to Kaiserreich Cinema's channel. Please do me a favor, click those links if you enjoy this video, give it a like, and if you've been enjoying the series so far, you know, make sure to hit the subscribe button on his channel and show the man some love. So yeah, we're gonna jump into it here. Like I said, episode 7, Crown and Crescent, Ottoman Empire, Middle East, Balkans, and Bulgaria. This Kaiserreich documentary series here on Kaiserreich.
You have brought a wolf inside our house. Egyptians. Jabal Shammar is a puppet to the Ottoman throne. This is a farce, an insult to the legacy of the first Arab rising.
Yet still you blame us for all grievances.
This is in 1938 too, huh?
We are here, are we not? Are we not pledged to your cause?
Let it be known the houses of Libya too protest making Jabal Shammar a part of this endeavor. Having these Ottoman dogs here is a disgrace to the Arab alliance.
We will never forget your betrayal during
Interesting.
the Arab rising of the Great War.
It seems obvious that a lot of these, Arabian Middle Eastern countries are not happy with the Ottoman Empire.
Good Arab fighters were martyred, while you groveled at the Ottoman Sultan's feet. This shame cannot be undone so easily.
The Sharif of Mecca and his revolt died due to your cowardice.
The Sharif of Mecca died because he fought an unwinnable war. The Sharif of Mecca died because he was a fool.
Them's fighting words, brother.
Silence! Do you not see, brothers? This is how the foreign imperialists have ruled us for centuries. By dividing us, by making us a tribe, house, family, where we should have seen a great Arab nation.
Even Egypt suffered British rule when there was no other option. Now we are freed. The King of Cairo has invited those Arab houses who surrendered in 1919.
It is time we bury these grievances and look together toward the future.
Trying to make a unified nation.
And dark it has been, the winter of imperialism in Arabia. But a new spring has come, brothers. The British Empire has collapsed. Germans and Ottomans squabble over the remains. In the Caucasus, Turks and Germans fight each other openly. Their alliance is worth less than the paper it is set upon now. Syndicalists prey upon our enemies' borders. Our foe is distracted, weakened, and the Arab cause has never been stronger. Today, we must stand united. This spear of Arab awakening, we will drive through the black heart of the Sultan. History calls upon you all, brothers, to fight, not for glory, not for house, but for the freedom of all the peoples of Arabia. Berlin is distracted, spread thin and far away. This is our day. This is our land. The Ottoman Empire will fall.
Yep.
Without the support of the Kaiserreich.
And I mean, it's also interesting how all these different factions are uniting around that too. and how it's like leading into what would be the next World War. Which is why I was saying before, like, I would love to see, like, once this documentary series gets through all the various factions and everything that happened during this time period, through World War One and after, leading into World War Two, if, you know, it would be cool to see them continue going on with what happened into World War Two, or what they would speculate would have happened in this alternate timeline. The Kaiserreich.
Today, many historians consider the Mediterranean as the birthplace of civilization itself. When the ancient empires of the Tigris and the Euphrates expanded west, they set in motion an era of societal and technological development that would span empires and generations.
Yeah.
Traders from the Orient sailed the Mediterranean ports, spreading their advanced literature and culture across the seas. These Levantine and Babylonian civilizations would form the cultural bedrock for the advanced empires that would later dominate the region. From the Assyrians and Hittites to the Greeks, and ultimately the Romans, great empires rose to rule this wealthy land on the crossroads of continents. However, no empire could last forever. The Roman Empire would eventually break up and dissolve, surviving only in the east under the Byzantine dynasty. The final death blow to these Roman remnants came in the form of a new rising power from the east, the House of Osman, a Turkish family so powerful their entire empire was named after them.
Well, I mean, it could be argued that technically the Roman Empire just kind of like became the church. And they, instead of like having a military kind of, you know, view of the world and trying to kind of take over things that way, they took a more religious approach to things.
Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople heralded the beginning of an Ottoman chapter in European history. Soon the Turkish Empire spanned from the mountains of the Caucasus to the deep deserts of Africa. This vast empire claimed the mantle of defender of the Ummah, the global community of Islam. To bolster their faiths, the Osman family took control of the two most holy cities in the faith, Mecca and Medina. In the end, the Turks would rule much of Europe for the better part of 500 years, before settling into a slow decline. By the dawn of the Great War, the Ottoman Empire had become a mere shadow of its former self. The birth of the nation-state gave rise to powerful forces of nationalism and identity, a process of awakening which would slowly degrade the lurching multi-ethnic empires of old. Now known as the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire struggled to maintain her once almighty presence. Already before the Great War, the Greeks and Bulgarians had reclaimed their sovereignty with support from Russia, while the Arab populations simmered with discontent. Yet, decline is never a straightforward path in the crossroads of continents. In the first 20 years of the 19th century, the balance of power here would shift not once, not twice, but thrice. When the Great War dawned on Europe, battle lines would be drawn deep into the Arabian deserts. Desperate to stave off their ultimate demise, the Ottomans found friends in Berlin, aligning with the Kaiserreich against their eternal enemies in St. Petersburg. Illustrious commanders would rise up to challenge the odds, both in the Ottoman Empire and in her enemies. Soon the power-hungry Bulgarians, ambitious Arabs, and reluctant Greeks would cast their fate into the cauldron of the Weltkrieg as well.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think, you know, especially for the Greeks, right, they just got back their sovereignty, so it's like they're kind of stuck in the middle, forced to pick a side. That's got to be a pretty shitty situation for them.
In this war to end all wars, the Eastern Theatre would see another great clash of civilizations. The nations of the southern Balkans believed the end of the Ottoman Empire was nigh, a miscalculation that would, in the end, cost them dearly. The Great War in the Near East had a distinctly different character from the trenches of France and Italy, which defined our memory of the war. While in the West, territorial gains were counted in miles and paid for in thousands of lives, the East would see more dramatic advances and reversals throughout the campaigns there. This different character was most apparent in the dynamic fighting in the Levant, which swung wildly from Ottoman to British control and back during the war. Further from the connected railways of Europe, the Great War in the Near East was defined more by supply lines than it was by fortifications.
Yeah.
In the distant and rough terrain of the Caucasus and the arid sands of the Arab peninsula, the war was constrained by supply points and the few available railways and telegram stations.
Yeah. And I mean, like, when you're going through so much desert territory too, it's like you're saying, the battle of supply lines is going to be how you're victorious, keeping your men fed and hydrated in that kind of environment so that they can actually fight and, you know, not have a morale breakdown. Big deal.
Fighting in the East, then, was not so much about controlling territory as it was about controlling railway junctions and ports.
Good to see you, Howard, man. Appreciate you stopping in.
By May 1916, the situation in the Middle East had improved considerably for the Central Powers. The Bulgarians had scored an easy victory against an unprepared Serbia, and Germany was confidently pushing back Russia in the Eastern Theatre. However, not all was well. The Ottomans still faced a difficult war on three fronts. In the Caucasus, clashes with Russia unfolded amidst an unforgiving climate, while the British relentlessly pressed on the Ottoman Levant.
Awesome, man. Glad you had a good time, brother.
Ottoman soldiers fiercely defended their territories and even scored several illustrious wins. For some historians, victories like the one at Gallipoli would be considered the Ottomans' very own finest hour. At Gallipoli, a massive naval landing by Entente forces was pushed back into the sea by determined Turkish defenders.
Interesting.
This auspicious victory would shine a spotlight on a rising commander inside the Ottoman army, a man named Mustafa Kemal. Born in 1881 in the Greek-majority city of Salonika, Mustafa Kemal rose quickly through the ranks of the Ottoman army. The commander became renowned for his strategic genius and determination to the cause of the empire. Kemal's loyalty to Ottoman ideals stood in stark contrast to the corrupt regime in Constantinople, and tensions between Kemal and the central government would define much of the course of the war.
That seems to be kind of like the major unifying factor of what's happened after World War I, is all these factions have had some kind of breakdown that led to the rise of syndicalism. Or either the rise of syndicalism or the rise of, you know, whatever factions to counter syndicalism, I guess you could say. Take it easy, Howard. Appreciate you stopping in as always, brother. You have a good night.
Despite these victories in the Levant and Western Front, the Ottoman state was a fragile one indeed. In the Great War, the true danger to Ottoman rule would come not from a foreign aggressor, but from within. By late 1916, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, conspired with the British to rise up against Ottoman rule. With his aspirations for an independent Arab state, the Sharif rallied an army and began attacking Ottoman garrisons and supply lines. The revolting Arabs, with the support of British commander T.E. Lawrence, began gaining ground at a rapid pace. Yet, Arab fortunes waned after the Turks mounted an organized resistance, and the revolt failed to achieve the swift victories London had been hoping for. In truth, the relationship between the British and the willful Arab leaders had been strained from the beginning. The failure of the Sharif to capture the port city of Aqaba almost fully eroded London's confidence that the Arabs would offer meaningful assistance in the Levant. Still, The British continued to supply aid, fearful that if their support ended, the allegiance of Sharif Hussein might shift back to the Sultan in Constantinople. By the summer of 1917, the war had ground to a complete standstill. The Arabs were contained, the Russians exhausted, and only the British threat in Egypt and Mesopotamia remained.
Yeah, I'm sure the British would have loved to have some kind of naval port down there that they could actually, get some troops into and some supplies. But without being able to take that port, I'm sure that probably made a huge difference in their influence in the war.
Looking for options, in those regions, the Entente attempted to open a new front closer to Constantinople by swaying Greece into joining the war. Greece had long been torn between competing sides.
Yeah.
Much of Athenian politics from 1914 onwards had been defined by a simple question. Should Greece join the war and reclaim Greek territories from the Ottomans, or not? The government was split into two factions, a pro-war Hawk cabinet and an anti-war Dove cabinet. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, a progressive liberal, ardently supported the Entente, while the conservative German king openly aligned with Berlin. By 1917, the pro-Entente Hawks had seized the government. Venizelos had outmaneuvered the reigning monarch, placed his own son on the throne, and steered Greece towards war with the Central Powers. Fueled with the ambition of reclaiming the historic city of Constantinople, Greek forces crossed the border into Ottoman holdings.
I mean, yeah, it's always kind of an easy argument, or I guess I feel like it's an easier kind of argument in those situations to persuade people to go to war when it's about, retaking your territory, reuniting, your lands with what used to be ancient, territories of Greeks, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like that's always an easier argument to persuade people to, but he also outmaneuvered the monarch at the time.
Unfortunately, their initial advance was flanked by determined Bulgarian defenders, and Greece simply could not fight two regional powers at once without Allied support. In the end, the Western Front collapsed in the spring of 1919, leading France to sign an armistice on August 12th. Greece, now without hopes for reinforcement, decided to end the fight prematurely the next day. Greece sued for peace, rather than risk the harsh treatment that capitulation would bring.
Well, and I mean, it's like I was saying earlier, they're literally caught in between everything. They got Russia on one side and, the Ottomans on the other side.
By 1919, the guns on the Western Front would fall silent. In the Ottoman Empire, however, fighting raged on and even intensified. East of the Adriatic, the final chapters of the Great War would be long and bloody indeed. Even after the ceasefire in the west, British armies besieged Ottoman positions in Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. In the Caucasus, the Sublime Porte faced a rogue army, ethnic violence, and a proxy war with Germany, once a trusted ally. The war in the Caucasus had been defined by treacherous mountain warfare and scarred by ethnic violence. By 1917, the Russian army had pushed deep into the Ottoman northeast. Constantinople blamed their mounting losses on local ethnic minorities, particularly the Armenians. Ottoman forces mounted a violent and organized repression, leaving 1 million civilians dead in their wake.
Damn.
These actions, combined with mounting ethnic violence in the Holy Land, would horrify the Western great powers and rally them against the Ottoman cause.
Yeah.
Germany, even while signing the Treaty of Versailles, would actually collude with the British Empire to put a stop to ethnic tensions in the Middle East and contain Ottoman violence.
Damn. You got some problems when Germany and Britain during this time period are working together to quell some stuff, all right?
After 1918, Berlin and Constantinople clashed openly on the diplomatic front and would even fight each other militarily in several campaigns. To understand the driving forces behind this dramatic shift inside the Central Powers alliance, we must first...
Yeah, Germany kind of looks like they got what they wanted out of the war, and we're like, well, good luck, boys.
First understand the balance of power in Constantinople itself. Since 1913, the Ottoman state, the so-called Sublime Porte, had been under the control of the Young Turks movement. The Young Turks were a diverse mixture of intellectuals and statesmen that aimed for the modernization, secularization, and preservation of the Ottoman Empire. The faction that ultimately came to power, however, would represent some of the most radical pan-Turkish ideologues in the party. They organized into the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, and ruled the empire with an iron grip. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire had been stumbling from conflict to conflict ever since the First Balkan War. The chaos in Constantinople was complete. Such a regime of constant violence and terror often gives rise to a strongman government, and the Sublime Porte was no exception. In the chaos of the war years, 3 key figures emerged from the CUP that would eventually gain complete control of the Ottoman state. This was the start of the triumvirate chapter in Ottoman history, often referred to as the rule of the 3 pashas. The triumvirate informally held total control of the Ottoman Empire, but did so more in the style of medieval warlords rather than any notion of modern parliamentary government. Nominally, the triumvirate was led by Grand Vizier Talat Pasha.
I don't know, I feel like historically speaking, from everything that I know, having shared power groups like this and that kind of a setup never works out. It always ends up coming down to infighting or someone trying to outmaneuver another one to gain, what do they have, more power, etc.
To the never-ending war, however, much of the apparatus...
Or they end up going to war with other countries, and then, one ruling power makes alliances with another one to outmaneuver, someone else, etc., etc. It never ends up working out.
Of state was invested in the military. These branches were led by the Minister of the Navy, Jamal Pasha, and, most prominently, the Minister of War, Enver Pasha. Enver Pasha, commander of the Ottoman military, was a key figure in holding the empire together during the early war years. His proclivity for violence and repression would only worsen, however. By the late chapters of the war, Enver Pasha had come to follow a radical pan-Turkish ideology. In the mind of the War Pasha, no method was too dark to ensure the survival of the Turkish state. Many observers now consider Enver Pasha to be, if not outright mad, then at the very least dangerously unstable. Unfortunately, his reign of terror was fully backed by the other pashas in the triumvirate. Under their rule, some of the most heinous acts in the Weltkrieg would be committed. The desire of the Young Turk triumvirate to incorporate the Caucasus into its Turkish ethnic empire drove Ottoman military repression in the region. However, the Turks were not the only claimants in the Caucasus. Aside from the Georgians, Armenians, and Azeris, the Germans also expressed keen interest in the area. Not long before, Germany had secured vast territories from the crumbling Russian Empire, and already diplomats were drawing up plans for new German-aligned client states in the region. When the Russians retreated from the Caucasus as well, the Kaiser's eye was drawn even further east.
Yep.
Germany, bolstered by victory in the Weltkrieg, began pursuing an increasingly self-interested diplomatic tract. Faced with unreliable allies in Vienna and Constantinople, Berlin began dreaming of a post-war world where it, and not the Central Powers Alliance, would hold all the power.
Of course. How it
Especially
always
considering
goes.
the weak performance of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire in the war, Germany grew resentful of her imperial allies. In the minds of the German elite, Germany did not need allies as much as it needed tightly controlled client states. Such a belt of smaller powers, completely under the sway of
Interesting.
Berlin, could be reinforced with economic influence in outlying areas. For this plan of a united German Mittel Europa, the Caucasus could provide a most useful boon: oil. By 1916, Azerbaijan represented some of the largest and most developed oil fields in Europe.
I mean, yeah, like, obviously you look at how things in the world work today, and oil runs pretty much just about everything, you know what I mean?
Oil was rapidly becoming a crucial resource for the world's industry,
Yep.
and Germany knew very well that industry was power. Berlin avidly sought to connect the large oil reserves in Azerbaijan to her new holdings in Eastern Europe. If added to Germany's growing belt of client states, Baku could fuel German dominance for decades to come.
Yep.
To link Baku to Ukraine, Germany eagerly sought collaboration with the now independent Caucasus republics. In 1918, Germany and Georgia signed the Treaty of Poti, establishing Georgia as an independent state protected by the Kaiserreich. In return, the nascent government in Tbilisi awarded generous concessions to German oil companies. It was becoming evident that Ottoman and German visions for the Caucasus were fundamentally incompatible.
Yep, they were different.
In the chaotic year following the retreat of Russian forces, Constantinople attempted to outmaneuver the Germans by being first into the region. From Constantinople, Enver Pasha commanded his loyalists to lead a campaign into the Caucasus and to seize the territory before the Germans could. Enver's half-brother Kiligili was placed at the head of a paramilitary force consisting of Islamic Caucasians, Ottoman forces, and other auxiliaries from all parts of the empire. This expedition would become known as the Islamic Army of the Caucasus, or in short, the Army of Islam. This Army of Islam would go down in infamy, committing atrocious war crimes under the pretense of securing the region for Turks and Muslims. The Army of Islam invaded Armenia and Georgia in full force and began clashing with Georgians and Germans during the summer of 1918. To many historians, the Georgia crisis marked the death of the Central Powers alliance. Ottoman and German forces began fighting each other openly in the Caucasus. Deaths on both sides were mounting rapidly, and neither of the supposed allies seemed intent on giving up the region. Ottoman forces
All for oil, man. All for oil.
had the advantage, however, due to their proximity to Armenia.
Yep.
German forces had been deployed from Ukraine,
Again,
but were
supply
outnumbered
lines.
by the advancing Army of Islam. After pushing the Germans back, the Ottomans captured Baku and moved further north, much to Berlin's dismay. While the Germans and Ottomans remained allies on paper, the Kaiserreich was forced to
It's so funny. Like, how can you consider yourselves allies even on paper when you're openly in conflict with each other and people are dying on each side? That's hilarious.
react to
It's like, we'll fight each other over this, but if anyone else gets involved, we're gonna fight you guys, you know?
Enver Pasha's brazen war crimes and challenges to Berlin in the Caucasus. Ever the subtle political player, Berlin leveraged Ottoman reliance on German military assistance rather than challenge Constantinople directly. On October the 4th, German agents had persuaded Sultan Mehmed VI to fire Enver Pasha, nominally for his military failures on the Caucasus front. Rather than surrender to this cloak and dagger scheme, however, Enver Pasha fled to the Caucasus.
It
to
wouldn't
take personal
surprise me,
command of the
Talisman.
Army of Islam. Now beyond the control of the central government, Enver Pasha continued his campaign of terror in Armenia. The war Pasha pushed through the region with the pretension of forming a great Islamic Turkish empire, spreading well into Central Asia. The Ottomans were now openly fighting, not only the Entente, but their German allies.
That's
and even
crazy, man.
themselves.
I mean, just in general, like opening up, it's never a good thing to have, you know, to be fighting on multiple fronts against multiple factions. It never, again, historically, really works out well. It might for a time, but then eventually, you know, resources run short and you get overrun.
For Enver Pasha and the Ottoman Empire as a whole, this
Yeah, it's
chapter
just a
in
proxy
history
war, yeah.
represented the full
Yeah.
extent of the Sublime Porte's descent into tribalism and lawlessness. Upon sacking Enver Pasha, the remaining two pashas clamped down on the Sultan and the restless Ottoman parliament. On March 21, 1919, they placed the Sultan under house arrest to the backdrop of politicians fleeing Constantinople. The empire had now descended into total chaos. One man, however, could still turn the tide. Deep in the trenches of the southern front, Mustafa Kemal looked northwards and saw his nations spiral into madness. For the time being, however, he was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the invading British army.
See, so the Ottomans are at war with the British, the Germans, and they said the Entente, right? Well, I mean, that's the British, right? Weren't they at the war with the Russians still too at the time? Weren't they going against like three people and two enemy factions and one that's supposed to be an ally? Like, that's
Throughout
crazy.
the Weltkrieg, the British had made considerable efforts to dislodge Kemal and punch through to the Ottoman heartland, the Anatolian Peninsula. To achieve this, London struck at the Sublime Porte from every angle it could, using a direct military campaign in the Holy Land, as well as leveraging Arab militias and local revolts. The British, of course, did not do so out of any true allegiance to a free Arab world. Rather, Great Britain sought to acquire dominion of the Middle East herself,
Of course.
and place the Arab nations under the crown in Westminster.
I mean, and again, it all comes down to oil. You know, during that time period, industrialization was the thing, and whoever could become more industrialized quicker and produce more goods quicker, they would, you know, become the superpower in the world, and et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, they want to take this over so they can have all the oil to themselves.
In many ways, the British
Gotcha.
continued their fight with the Ottomans after 1919 as a last-ditch effort. London had, after all, lost the Weltkrieg in France, and much of her efforts past 1919 were focused on securing at least some gains from a war which had so far been nothing but an unmitigated disaster. This first Arab revolt, then, would put the Arabs between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, Arab revolutionaries fought an Ottoman state which spiraled ever further into ethnic violence. On the other, the British represented an unreliable partner at best, and a new flavor of imperialist oppressor at worst. To the Arabs, it was perfidious Albion indeed. While the Arab revolt had yielded little territorial gains for the remains of the Entente, the Sharif still succeeded in distracting and weakening Kemal's front line. By 1919, the British had broken through Ottoman lines in the Sinai. By the end of the next year, they had occupied much of the Ottoman south. Entente forces were pushing north through Palestine and well into Syria, as well as circling around from southern Mesopotamia. Between the British and the heart of the Ottoman Empire stood one man. Defense of the southern front fell to Mustafa Kemal, who had risen to prominence after the Battle of Gallipoli. By September 1918, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Ottoman Empire was flanked from all sides and could not hold the Levant. When Jamal Pasha sent Kemal to a stand-or-die order in Syria, Kemal resolutely refused. To the outrage of the triumvirate, the commander retreated to a more defensible position in southeastern Anatolia, near the historic city of Alexandretta. Entente forces had now been allowed to cross into Turkish lands as well, a major blow to Ottoman morale. This strategic gamble would, however, pay dividends for Kemal's forces in the end. The British, hoping to secure a killing blow against Anatolia, launched a major attack by advancing on the town of Maras. However, a joint German-Ottoman force managed to hold out and push the British back. At last, the British army had been halted at the gates of Anatolia. After this victory, Kemal seemed poised to begin pushing the invaders back. However, before he could launch a counterattack, Talat Pasha pulled a large section of his troops away from the southern front to fight against Enver Pasha in the Caucasus.
Yeah.
This move gutted Kemal's ability to return
That's what I was saying. Infighting happens.
Syria to Ottoman control, and seemed like an intentional hamstring on the part of Germany. Even worse, Ottoman intelligence services had begun reporting that the Germans were engaging with British diplomats in secret. With the Central Powers fighting each other openly in the Caucasus, it was clear Germany...
I mean, what do you expect when you're already, you know, basically in open war, even though it's not been declared, with the Germans over, you know, these oil fields? What do you expect? Like, I don't know, like, how is it so much of a shock that they're starting to work with the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, you know? Oh my God, two of our enemies are starting to work together against us? Gasp.
Germany had no intention of honoring Ottoman territorial integrity.
Yeah, I don't know. So like, yeah, they're fighting each other and there, and then also the Ottomans are fighting themselves now as well, with one of the pashas going at war with another one. And then Germany and Britain are also secretly doing some kind of, you know, political back alliance behind the Ottomans' backs as well. So, like, there's all kinds of fuckery going on, apparently.
With British support, the Germans could end the Great War in a peace deal that favored only Berlin and threw her eastern ally to the wolves. This diplomatic betrayal would mark the beginning of Kemal's aversion to the German Empire. Still a firm believer of the great Ottoman cause, Kemal saw this backroom diplomacy as a great betrayal to the Ottoman people.
Of course.
In his fury, Kemal turned his attention to Constantinople. In the capital, tensions between the military and the triumvirate were quickly reaching a boiling point. By April 2nd, 1919, Kemal decided he had had enough of the political theatre in the capital. The dictatorship of Talat and Jamal Pasha was now openly dancing to the Kaiser's tune, the Sultan was under house arrest, and the parliament clamoured ever more for an end to the chaos. Kemal rallied his popular base against the authoritarian triumvirate and called for the military to seize control of the apparatus of state. On April 21st, he issued the Alexandretta Proclamation. From the trenches, Kemal called for the overthrow of the Young Turk dictatorship and an end to the Sultan's house arrest. The Pashas would attempt to dismiss the commander, but underestimated his popularity with the populace. Kemal was, after all,
often what happens,
the hero of Gallipoli and Alexandretta, who had held the British from taking Anatolia. The Pashas, on the other hand, were considered to be corrupt schemers who had brought nothing but ruin to the empire. When the Kemalists rose up in the capital to carry out his orders, the remnants of the triumvirate knew their days were numbered. Talat and Jamal Pasha fled the empire shortly after the Alexandretta Declaration, solidifying Kemal as the head of the Ottoman army and the new ruling political force within the empire. By the time the Young Turk triumvirate had come crashing down, the British army was in full retreat from Anatolia. Their earlier advances had vastly overstretched the waning royal army, leaving large gaps in their occupation of the Levant. Arab insurgents, sensing an opportunity to gain independence, turned their ire on the British. This Arab unrest in Syria forced the royal army to retreat all the way back to Jerusalem.
It's crazy how many alliances were broken and backstabbing and all this stuff is happening in this area during this time.
On November 6, 1919, the Weltkrieg finally, formally came to an end with the Treaty of Versailles. For the Ottomans, this treaty promised an end to never-ending war, but only in theory. While European diplomats toasted to peace in Europe, fighting would continue in the Middle East and the Levant throughout the winter. The Caucasus theatre would only be fully settled with the Caucasus Conference on November 30th. For Germany, gaining unfettered access to oil-rich Azerbaijan was critical. Thus, the Kaiserreich resorted to realpolitik once more by diverting Ottoman attention in the region. To secure Georgia and Azerbaijan, the Kaiserreich was more than willing to throw Armenia to the Turks as a gesture of goodwill. Initially, Mustafa Kemal, now holding power in Constantinople, was reluctant to accept the settlement. After the Germans had conspired with the Pashas earlier, the Ottoman commander knew better than to trust any deal the Kaiser offered.
True.
When it came to Kemal's Ottoman Empire, the British and Germans seemed more than happy to set aside their differences and carve up the Turkish state. Despite his misgivings, public sentiment in Constantinople desired, above all, an end to the war years. Betrayed by her allies, the Ottoman Empire reluctantly retreated from Georgia and Azerbaijan and accepted Armenia as a concession. The Armenian government, once promised independence by Germany,
I'm
was
sure
itself
not
thrown
happy
to the
about that
wolves
at
by
all.
yet another European colonial power. What was left of the independent government fled or was jailed. But this betrayal would not soon be forgiven by the Armenians. The sole remaining obstacle to peace in the Caucasus was Enver Pasha's Army of Islam, which continued to occupy much of Azerbaijan. It would be German Azeri troops that finally dislodged the mad warlord from the Caucasus. After being decisively defeated, Enver Pasha took full flight. On September 3, 1920, the last of the Pashas fled towards Turkmenistan in pursuit of his ethnic imperial desires, scattering his rogue army to the winds. In the south, the British army had initially refused to retreat from Palestine and Basra. In the Holy Land, much like in the Caucasus, the triumvirate regime had represented extreme ethnic violence, and reports of war crimes by Ottoman forces were common. British diplomats presented themselves as the sole protector of the region's Jewish population, as the community there had been repeatedly persecuted during the Weltkrieg on direct orders of the Young Turks. Sometime earlier, British forces had also begun evacuating Christian Assyrian communities from northern Iraq to British holdings elsewhere. While the British presented themselves as humanitarian protectors, much of their operations in the Middle East were also inspired by the desire for further colonial influence. Fighting between the British and Ottomans would continue into the 1920s as the empire settled their borders in the Levant.
I bet, Kauschman.
Here, after all the suffering of the Great War, the last chapter of the Weltkrieg would fade into a cynical colonial squabble. Ultimately, the British-Ottoman stalemate would be resolved with the Jerusalem Conference in 1920. With the support of the German Empire and the United States, Britain and the Ottomans agreed on a new peace in the region. Palestine, Basra, and the area around Mount Lebanon would get a treaty status similar to the pre-war position of Egypt and Cyprus.
Interesting.
Formally, all these areas would remain part of the Ottoman Empire. In practice, however, the Ottoman central government, the Sublime Porte, was forced to cede political control of these holdings. The Holy Land was placed under an international mandate, securing them against Ottoman aggression. The treaty further specified war reparations to be paid to the Ottoman Empire, a return of seized Ottoman warships, and the official abolition of the Ottoman Debt Council. One final thorn in the Ottoman side was the Arab revolt of Sharif Hussein bin Ali, whose insurgents proved particularly determined fighters, even with little means. In 1919, the Arabs had taken Medina, where they brutally slaughtered a tenth of the remaining Ottoman garrison.
Damn.
But, with the war ending on all other fronts, the remaining insurgents could not stand alone against the entire mass of the Ottoman army. Towards the end of 1920, Ali's revolt had been crushed. The independent Rashidi and Saudi dynasties, which had drifted away from the Sublime Porte during the revolt, now bent the knee once more. Despite all odds, the Ottoman Empire had survived to live into the 1920s. From the outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War in...
It's honestly crazy, too, with how many different factions they were against and all the infighting. It honestly is pretty crazy that the empire didn't collapse sooner and have, I guess, more repercussions for their actions at the end of the war, I guess would be the proper way of saying it.
1911 to the end of the Arab Revolt in 1920, 9 years of continuous war had reduced the once mighty empire to a patchwork of feudal dependencies and rogue forces, barely held together by Mustafa Kemal's authority. The Ottoman Empire had won every war it had partaken in, but only on paper. In truth,
how crazy is that too? With everything that I feel like that's just a situation where they stretch themselves too thin, too many fronts, fighting too many factions at the same time. And even though they won on paper every war, the resource cost was just too great and they couldn't keep up with everything they were trying to do.
Constantinople only navigated an end to her many wars under foreign mediation. The Turks would have peace, but only after being humiliated internationally and betrayed by her former allies.
Yeah.
The once proud empire had been forced to give up territory and authority and gain only pittances in return.
So are these essentially like various little nation states that have like sprung up from that? That's crazy if that's the case.
In addition, the wounds of a decade of war would not heal easily. Armed tribes roved the Arabian peninsula, paying little to no mind to Ottoman pretensions of authority. The Caucasus returned to a status quo that heavily favored Berlin. The southern Levant had become a Western colony in all but name. In truth, the Ottoman Empire had not died a sick man. Not truly. The empire had simply entered a state of suspended animation and survived despite the failure of all her institutions. Western newspapers no longer called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. Now the Sublime Porte was simply referred to as the failed state.
Talia, my flower, my Chicheum. In the end, I sometimes wonder what the Great War really accomplished for us.
Yeah.
Out in the Levantine deserts, as we set out daily to police another raided settlement, log another bombed train, I do not believe we have gained much. The village calls me a veteran, a hero. But you know the dark doubts of my heart, Chicheum. My career was not heroism, it was butchery. I was lucky to have survived the war, when so many better men were left in those desert sands. I spend my days with you, but every night I return to the Levant. I see a trail of Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, and Kurds lay behind me. All dead, fighting over an empire that is nothing but a faded relic. I am tired, Chicheum. And tired men look for strong ones to guide them. I cast our fates now with the Vizier Kemal, the one man who held faith when all others gave up, the man who broke the corrupt Young Turks and pushed the British from our homeland. He sends me to the Middle East, the lands of Al Saud, Egypt, Rashidi. There are rumblings in the West, Chicheum. A new ideology, syndicalism, spreads through our defeated Entente enemies. The winds of war blow eastwards, my love, as they have always done. I would tell you I am taking this posting to support the Vizier, to secure our land. But we both know I just need time. Farewell, Chicheum. I wish I were a stronger man.
Bro, if there's one thing to be said about this documentary series, the quotes that they do like this, they always hit hard, man. They always hit hard.
In the end, the long war in the East ended in exhaustion rather than celebration. For the people of the Eastern Mediterranean, the 1920s would bring no great triumphs or ascending empires. The front lines had instead settled into new, precarious stalemates. The Ottomans and Bulgarians had won the Weltkrieg, but at great cost. Both suffered from the demilitarization of their economy and the slow decline of German aid. While Bulgaria had achieved her territorial ambitions, it had done so at the cost of internal stability, surrendering much of the hinterland to non-state actors. Already in the 1920s, this nominal peace in the region seemed little more than a temporary ceasefire. In the west, the Greeks were turning again to their hawkish politicians, showing no intention of honoring the Treaty of Versailles. In the south, a new Arab leadership emerged that appeared more than willing to continue the long war Hussein had started a decade before. Both London and Berlin would keep the lid on these tensions, for now. While the Ottoman Empire had regained some territory, it had also lost sovereignty over several of her larger holdings. In truth, the costs of this German-dominated peace far outweighed their spoils. In addition to territorial losses, the Sublime Porte was left with a devastated economy and an insurgency paralyzing her Arabian holdings. After a disastrous Caucasian adventure, the fall of the triumvirate, and a humiliating peace in the Levant, the empire lurched into the new decade barely clinging to life.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
And yet, despite it all, there was reason for optimism. Constantinople had not fallen. The path towards reform and survival was narrow, but it was still open.
And they seemed, I think, finally be like unified, at least their military is, under one leader. Which again, that's like what I was saying earlier. Whenever you have a split leadership like they had, the triumvirate, like historically speaking, from everything that I know, and I'm not a historical expert by any means, but those situations never seem to really work out. Like dividing power amongst individuals, it just never seems to really work out.
The collapse of the triumvirate in 1919 had shattered the politically entrenched CUP party, shifting power to Mustafa Kemal and the military staff. Now politically ascendant, Kemal attained the position of Minister of War. His appointment by the Sultan represented, in many ways, a last-ditch effort to restore any semblance of authority to the realm. Kemal had long dreamt of developing the Ottoman state into a modern republic. For the time being, however, his efforts were blocked by the willful and authoritarian Sultan Mehmed, who would not soon forget the indignation of being jailed by his own government during the reign of the Pashas. The restored Sultan tightened the grip of the monarchy, intervening.
That's what I was going to say. In a situation like that where he's, essentially retaking power after being jailed, he's only going to, rule with an even tighter grip than he did before.
In the political process to block any whiff of liberal legislation. Elections were postponed, and repression against progressive parties was ramped up.
Which that could lead to more political
Armenians,
uprisings.
And Arabs, continually dissatisfied with imperial policies, took to the streets. Their grievances were further fueled by the lackluster trials following the devastating crimes inflicted upon them during the Weltkrieg.
Plus, with the word of syndicalism rising up again, even if a lot of factions don't turn to like syndicalism, it's still the idea of revolution spreading throughout Europe and throughout the world is going to lead to more uprisings, especially when you have an imperial dictator now trying to lock down even harder than before.
What the Ottoman Empire lacked in central authority, it attempted to make up for in brutal repression. In the hinterlands of the empire, Ottoman military and police forces battled insurgents of all banners. Threats to the Ottoman state, from calls to democracy to separatist minority groups, were increasingly answered with the iron fist of the Sultan. However, these seemingly dire circumstances bore a silver lining. France and Russia had ceased to be relevant powers in the region, as both nations had collapsed into left-wing revolutions in the chaotic post-war years. Now, freed from foreign influence, Constantinople was able to aggressively nationalize companies and infrastructure once held by foreign owners. As a result, the Anatolian homeland found itself in an economic upswing.
Interesting.
With France and Russia in the throes of revolution and the British Empire in decline, the former hegemons were powerless to protest. In a few feverish years of consolidation, almost all of the empire's railways, ports, and power lines were returned to the rule of the Sublime Porte.
Damn.
Tax revenue from these assets fueled an unprecedented economic boom. Even more enticing was the incredible growth of the Ottoman oil industry.
Yeah.
Whose
That's what I was
Iraqi
gonna say.
oil fields.
That's what I was going to say. Like, it's surprising to me with Russia in decline, with France in decline, and Britain in decline. I would assume then that Germany is still busy trying to consolidate everything that it's gained at the end of the war, that it's not able to necessarily focus on trying to claim or reclaim any of the oil fields that it was going after before, leaving them, the Ottoman Empire essentially free reign over the oil fields, which, again, during this industrializing period, that's a big deal.
Fueled Germany's economic resurgence after the war. While the Ottoman Empire consolidated her rule at home, a new storm was brewing to the west. The Treaty of Versailles had aimed to bring a new order to the Balkans, but had failed to meet the defeated nations halfway. German and Austrian influence had once guaranteed the treaty, but both powers were now increasingly absorbed by their own domestic crises and the rise of syndicalism abroad. This left the onus of guarding the new balance of power to Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, and neither was truly up to the task. After the Great War, Bulgaria had claimed the mantle of hegemon of the Balkans. With much of Macedonia, Thrace, Serbia, and Dobruja under its control, it would be the Bulgarians who would have to guarantee stability in this region. By the end of the war, Bulgaria had demanded and received an incredible amount of territory from her neighbors. This Bulgarian greed was happily enabled by Germany, who considered Sofia to be a more reliable partner in the Balkans than Constantinople. Now the Bulgarian Tsar had his tsardom spanning 2 seas. Yet it was evident that the Tsar's eyes were bigger than his stomach.
They always are.
Bloated and war-torn, the Sofia government was not able to assert any meaningful authority over her new territories. Constant uprisings by Serbs, Romanians, and Greeks prevented the nation from finding any semblance of normalcy until 1924, when it was finally able to demobilize. Economically, the Prussia of the Balkans had become completely reliant on German economic aid. In Sofia, governmental collapse and re-elections had become part of everyday life. In 6 years, almost a dozen Bulgarian governments had been formed and dissolved.
Wow.
Some lasting no more than a month.
That's crazy.
Even worse, when the nation demobilized, it left...
Like, on the one hand, it makes me wonder, like, how the average person during those times of turmoil, like, what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to think? Feel secure about their country and their nation with that much political upheaval and change? But at the same time, like, just trying to live life, they might not even necessarily be able to focus on any of that, and life would probably, I guess, for the most part, just run like it always had. They get up, they go to work, do what they got to do, come home, and the world turns around them, I guess. You know what I'm saying?
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
That's crazy.
Jobless, broke, and bitter. These veterans turned to the Military League, a far-right organization that openly desired to overthrow Bulgaria's fragile democracy. The Military League projected its power over Bulgaria through the so-called Orana, a paramilitary organization that held sway in much of the Tsardom's new territories. For all intents and purposes, the government in Sofia controlled only half the country, while the other half was surrendered to the Orana shadow state.
Interesting.
The real threat to Balkan stability came not from the struggling Bulgarians, however, but rather from the vengeful Greeks. Greece had ended the war prematurely in hopes of finding a more favorable peace. In the end, Greece was forced to cede Thrace to Bulgaria and the Aegean Islands to the Ottoman Empire. Additionally,
they're going to want
the
that
Hellenic
back.
state was burdened with the hefty weight of reparations to be paid to the Central Powers. All in all, this was a relatively mild outcome compared to the harsh treatment endured by Serbia, Romania, and Russia. Initially, it seemed like the Greeks were likely to settle into an isolationist monarchy. However, the Hellenic state could swing widely between accepting this new status quo or adopting the ultra-nationalist ambitions of uniting all Greek lands, the so-called Megali idea.
And that's what I was talking about earlier, that persuasion of, a united Greek Empire again, reuniting all lost territories to, the former ancient glory days when, Greek was the great power in the world. That can be an alluring argument.
The instability in Athens came to a head during the 1920s Pangalos crisis, which nearly tipped the Balkans into yet another Balkan War. That year, the democratic process in Athens was overturned by a putsch led by Theodoros Pangalos. At first glance, the coup leader subscribed to the idea of the greater Greek state. Despite his populist streak, he seemed more interested in total control of Greece than he was in foreign policy. Not long after his rise, Pangalos seized all Greek institutions, proclaimed the Second Hellenic Republic, and made himself the undisputed dictator of the country. For the Sublime Porte, the mad dictator of Greece was a major concern, one that only worsened when Pangalos made his first move. Without second consideration, he demanded the return of all Greek territory from Bulgaria under threat of military action. Sophia declined, believing it could call Athens' bluff. By July 1921, skirmishes broke out along the Greek-Bulgarian border, and the world held its breath, fearing yet another Balkan war. The crisis was averted, however, when Pangalos found himself at the short end of a counter-coup. The new Greek government quickly de-escalated the rising tensions and agreed to abide by the Treaty of Versailles. While the Pangalos crisis was short-lived, the mad dictator would cast a long shadow over Greece. The coup and counter-coup
a lot of eyes are going to be watching Greece then after that.
Political structures and set the stage for a decade of turmoil in Athens. Despite nominally controlling Arabia, embers of the Arab revolt continued to simmer. Several Ottoman subjects had filled the void left by waning central authority. The most important among these was Hejaz, which played a large role during the Weltkrieg. While still an Ottoman holding, Hejaz was culturally important to the Arab spirit. After all, it was the region which contained both of Islam's holy cities, Mecca and Medina, the control of which had long been a pillar of Ottoman power. In Mecca, the Turks could claim to hold the mantle of protector of the Ummah, the global society of Islam. Despite all this, Ottoman influence had been receding from these holy sites, being replaced instead by nascent Arab nationalism. In truth, Ottoman control of her Arab client states was built on quicksand. Arab regions like Hejaz paid lip service to the central government while never ceasing their efforts to undermine the authority of the Sublime Porte in Arabia.
That didn't surprise me.
Hejaz was not the only aspiring Arab force in the region, however. Outside of the Ottoman and British spheres were the only Arab states that could claim some independence: the Rashidi-led Emirate of Jebel Shammar to the north, and the Saudi-dominated states of Najd and Hassa to the south. While nominally both were tributary states to the Ottoman Empire, the outlooks of the two feuding countries was very different indeed. Jebel Shammar closely aligned itself with the Ottoman Empire. This client state had remained loyal to the Sublime Porte during the Weltkrieg and even during the Arab Revolt. For this loyalty, the Rashidi rulers of the emirate would see handsome rewards. The Ottoman Empire was keen to keep the Rashidis on their side as they protected the vulnerable Ottoman south. Kissing the ring of Constantinople was not without its dangers, however. Their alignment to the Sublime Porte made the Rashidis hated in the Arabian world. Najd and Hassa, led by the hyper-conservative Saudi dynasty, did not share Rashidi loyalty to the Ottomans. Both families would feud over control of the peninsula during the Weltkrieg, but a decisive victory never came. The Saudis had hoped for British support in the Arab uprising, but saw the Entente back the rivaling Sharif of Mecca instead. Not wanting to help their nemesis, the Saudis fell into an awkward neutrality during the war. At times, they would even side with the Ottomans by launching raids into the Entente-aligned Hijaz.
I'm sure they were not happy about that.
Still, the Saudi state held no love for their Central Powers associates. The end of the Weltkrieg had gained Nejd and Hassa absolutely nothing, save for an even more overbearing Ottoman adversary. This stagnation and turmoil continued to mark the Arabian Peninsula until the balance of power dramatically shifted in 1925. That year would go down in infamy as the start of the British syndicalist revolution. This syndicalist revolution...
It's interesting how, like, even though syndicalism really kind of started in France and spread from there, it's the overthrow of the British monarchy and them essentially being exiled. That seems to be like the major divergence point where everything kind of like really spreads and goes haywire from there.
Would shatter the delicate post-war balance in the Middle East.
And of course, and it makes sense.
The British Empire had long been considered unassailable. Even after a humiliating defeat in the Great War, London continued to project strength around the world through her vast holdings and powerful navy and economy. London's shadow ever loomed over the Levant, where it procured concessions through the Western-administered Jerusalem Accords. This new status quo was not to last. Ever since the end of the Great War, Germany had been chipping away at British hegemony. In 1925, the Kaiser would finally get his wish, but perhaps not in the way that he would have liked it. That year, wildcat labor strikes across Britain quickly turned into a full-scale revolution, funded by French syndicalists. The scale and speed at which the British Home Isles fell to revolution
it actually is insane.
Observers.
Yeah.
When London was taken by syndicalist forces, they proclaimed the new Union of Britain and pushed
and how radical they became
into exile in Canada. The loss of the Home Isles effectively cut the British Empire off at the head and began a process of rapid decline. Over the next few years, London's empire would dissolve until it was nothing more than a squabbling alliance of loyalist remnants. The British Empire, a stabilizing force in the Middle East for nearly 2 centuries, seemed to have vanished overnight, leaving a major power vacuum in her wake. At first, dissolution of British authority brought some relief to the Ottoman cause. Since the unceremonious retreat of the United Kingdom in the Weltkrieg after 1919, few of the Middle Eastern states had strong ties with the British as a reliable partner. While the global market shock still rocked the Ottomans, Constantinople had long before shifted her economy towards Berlin and Vienna rather than London. However, the indirect geopolitical impact of Britain's fall was enormous. With central authority dissolving, British holdings in Cyprus, the Persian Gulf, and most notably Egypt, became sudden political wildcards. The Suez Canal no longer...
And everyone's going to be scrambling for it.
The waters of the Mediterranean were no longer protected by the Royal Navy. The fragile balance in the region had been fractured. Between the encroaching Germans and the collapse of the British Empire, the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean found themselves in a constantly shifting environment, fueling political instability for decades to come. Most prominently, the retreat of Britain's hand from the Islamic world guaranteed the independence of Persia and Egypt, forever altering the precarious power balance of the Middle East. Free from London's shackles, the resurgent Egyptian kingdom was hell-bent on eclipsing the Ottomans as the dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian self-rule would have large ramifications. The rise of a challenger in Cairo reignited nationalist fervor in Arabia, Armenia, Greece, and even Persia. The Arab flag over Cairo became a focal point for all Arabs who opposed the Ottoman Empire and showed that there was a future for Arabia free from imperialist rule. The Ottoman Empire now faced a new, post-colonial Middle East. The British foe had been replaced with a new Egyptian and Persian one. Despite these new challenges, however, the Ottoman Empire too gained much from the end of the British Empire. While the British did not control any parts of the Sublime Porte directly, their hated influence was everywhere, from the internationally administered banks and railways to the Western Mandate states of the Near East. Without the Royal Army there to back London's claims, most of these holdings returned to direct Ottoman control. For the Empire, it would be the start of a chapter of Ottoman reconstruction. In the Caucasus, the Ottomans had learned to capitalize quickly on any opportunity. This was, after all, an age defined by realpolitik, and the perfidious Kaiserreich was never far away. As soon as the Royal Army retreated, the Ottomans moved quickly to secure concessions lost in the previous century. Within months, the Ottoman army had entered Cyprus, reintegrated Basra, annexed Kuwait, and moved on to the British Sinai.
Damn.
Here, however,
they're not wasting time
by the freshly arrived German fleet, which snatched the Suez Canal away from the Sultan's grasp. Like Constantinople, Berlin was equally eager to fill the void left by the British Empire. Losing the Suez Canal to German meddling constituted a loss of prestige and considerable income for the Sublime Porte. Grievances such as these would further fracture.
Still to this day, the Suez Canal is a huge, shipping lane. That's the word I was looking for. My brain had a moment there. Yeah, I mean, it's still a huge shipping lane. So, I mean, the fact that they weren't able to take both sides of it, and that essentially kind of really cut them off from another shipping lane into Europe.
Fracture the relations between the former Central Power allies. In the wake of the colonial scramble,
just the Mediterranean in general, they lost access to,
Berlin,
at least by ship.
Cold after the Caucasus War, became downright adversarial. Despite this, British collapse proved to be beneficial for the Ottomans in the long term. Foreign-owned banks were closed and replaced by the brand new Ottoman National Honor Bank. With foreign influence receding, the Ottoman Empire was once again free to grow and develop on its own terms. Furthermore,
Germany is the only other major faction at the moment that they really kind of have to worry about. Other than that, it's just other smaller nation states and uprisings and any kind of, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Not political uprisings, but I guess any kind of, civil unrest. That's the word I was looking for, especially with the spread of syndicalism.
Sublime State was quickly becoming a global oil exporter. This steady flow of black gold would fund many Ottoman reconstruction and modernization efforts, including a sprawling railway network. Industrialization efforts swept across the region, and it was apparent that a new age had dawned for the Middle East. This economic springtime would bring with it a thaw of the authoritarian Ottoman regime. By early 1926, the harsh rule of Sultan Mehmed VI came to an end. The unpopular Sultan was succeeded by his more moderate cousin, Abdul Majid II.
Interesting.
The new Sultan proved his more modern points of view by calling for general elections and lifted the ban on political organizations in 1927. Two parties emerged in this widening political landscape. Mustafa Kemal, the decorated war hero, absorbed many remnants of the former Young Turks into his Ottoman People's Party, or OPP. His growing party was dedicated to secularization, centralization, and modernization. His main adversary was the Freedom and Accord Party, or FACP, which staunchly opposed Mustafa Kemal's centralization efforts. Its promise of decentralization and a more pluralistic interpretation of the empire made it an appealing party to the empire's non-Turkish population, which had remained sidelined in recent social and economic.
So it sounds like it's more of like the Turkish classes and I guess the old guard versus the non-Turks and potentially more of the working man, I guess. Those are the two kind of parties that seem to be forming around with these reforms that are happening.
Economic reforms. The elections of 1927 would not see a decisive victory for either party. While a liberal wind did sweep through the Ottoman Empire, issues around centralization and minority rights fragmented public opinion. In the end, Mustafa Kemal, as leader of the largest party, was appointed Grand Vizier by the Sultan. Despite lacking a clear electoral majority, Kemal set the empire onto his path of modernization. He wasted no time developing his new brand of Turkish nationalist rule with a liberal flair. The economy was nationalized, censorship laws were loosened, and in all dimensions of public life, Kemal separated state and religion.
Damn.
Kemal's feverish secularization would make him many enemies, however. Religious elites, non-Muslim minorities, and non-Turkish ethnic groups had little appetite for the changes.
It seems like a recipe for a lot of problems down the line, especially with his, separating church and state policies
Mustafa Kemal was enforcing. His opposition would unite in new parties, endeavoring to oppose Kemal's secularization efforts. The more conservative opposition united in the Ottoman Defense Party, or ODP. They were joined by the older FAP and a new, more radical Ottoman party for decentralization. While each of these opposition parties had strong feelings about how the empire should function, they agreed to work together to keep Kemal from achieving his total separation of religion and state.
Interesting.
They
all have common ground with that, right? And again, that's what I was saying, that whole separation of church and state, that's got to be, as they're talking about here, a pretty big, division in the country.
Kemal's term, the Ottoman Empire experienced a general increase in the standards of living. Imported electronics and an ever-expanding railway network continued to connect Anatolia to the vast outlying territories, which had long been scarred by war and neglect. Despite these advancements, Kemal's aggressive and ruthless centralization did little to abate the unrest in Arab lands. This unrest was particularly capitalized upon by the religious OPAD, which actually managed to defeat Kemal's OPP in the general elections of 1931. The new Grand Vizier, Haki al-Azm, would not enjoy a stable tenure either. His cabinet was formed of a so-called Grand Coalition, a broad alliance which included the more liberal-minded OPAD and FAP, as well as the conservative OPP. These parties were united in their dislike for Kemalist policies, but little beyond that. In truth, the squabbling coalition of liberals, non-Muslim minorities, and Islamic fundamentalists was doomed from the start. Without clear direction, the coalition focused mostly on undermining Kemalist support. Such adversaries...
See, and that's something that I find interesting too. They're so focused on undermining Kemal, but it seems like they don't really have a plan for what's supposed to happen afterwards. And that seems like that would just lead to a lot more civil unrest and potentially civil war.
Imperial policies were to the dismay of the liberals in the coalition. Within a year, the al-Azm administration had collapsed.
Yep.
Despite this turmoil, the oil kept flowing, funding a slow resurgence of the Ottoman economy.
See, and to me, that makes me wonder, like, and that's kind of, in those situations, would then, like, a lot of oil barons, because of the wealth they're gaining, start to become more politically involved and be able to take over things with these, what's the word I'm looking for? Like weak governments, I guess. That's not really the word I'm looking for, but that's essentially what I mean. These government factions or whatever, these political factions that really don't have kind of a steady footing or whatever and keep collapsing. It wouldn't surprise me if that ends up being what would happen in this, alternate timeline where a lot of very wealthy businessmen might start taking over and influencing a lot of political issues because they just control the oil.
The Sublime Porte embarked upon a campaign of even more railway expansion, increasing central authority by improving the connections between her far-flung desert holdings.
Well, and I mean, also, like, railways at that time, that's kind of like the lifeblood for land good transportation, right? If you don't have shipping lanes, that's how you got to ship your goods or import goods. And also, that's how you can spread influence with, military might by transporting troops as quickly as you can over land at that time. So the more railways you got, the better at that time.
Despite these advancements, Ottoman survival remained far from certain. Mustafa Kemal regained his position as Grand Vizier after the Great Coalition fell.
Interesting.
But his political mandate was once again
Can't keep the man down.
Not only did Kemal have to contend with dissent in Turkish ranks, the Arabs themselves had begun politically organizing as well. New Arab nationalist parties had risen in the wake of the failure of the OPAD administration, eagerly supported by Egyptian agents. In the Levant, for instance, many turned to Antun Sade's Syrian Socialist National Party, which aimed for a greater Syrian state, free from Ottoman dominance.
Well, and again, there's socialism coming up.
And while the Ottomans struggled to
That would make me wonder if that doesn't have some kind of syndicalist roots that end up showing up.
balance the Kemalists and the anti-Kemalists, the Arabs were already drawing new maps in the Middle East and convening with Egyptian diplomats in secret. The Arab tributaries of the Ottoman Sultan had never truly accepted Ottoman rule and saw the growing divide between Constantinople and her German protectors as an opportunity to strike. In the West, at least, the Ottoman frontier had grown more peaceful. Greece settled into a tacit acceptance of the status quo. Bulgaria, meanwhile, was still caught up in Balkan politics, which posed no imminent threat to the Sublime Porte itself. In the 1930s, against the backdrop of an ever more present Arab threat, Ottoman concerns revolved primarily around rising tensions with Germany. Throughout the 1920s, German-Turkish relations had slowly been relegated to mere theatrics. The former Central Powers pretended to be on good terms, but few around the Sublime Porte were truly happy with German encroachment. In truth, Germany had never stopped pursuing their concept of realpolitik. Berlin leveraged its economic power to exert influence on not just the Ottomans, but all her neighboring states.
Of course.
In the Caucasus and Egypt, the Germans had built a strong presence. These German-aligned states were joined by revanchist regional powers, such as Iran, forming a diplomatic encirclement of the Ottoman Empire. After the chaos of the war years and the gruesome ethnic violence of the Pashas, most countries trusted the Sublime Porte only as far as they were able to contain it.
Yeah.
The Caucasus, Iran, and Arabia all formed dangerous flashpoints, each of which could easily dissolve the struggling Ottoman Empire. All hated the Ottomans. Some.
It's crazy, honestly, how they survived through the war, the Ottoman Empire, how they survived through the war the way they did, had such, kind of an economic surge and regrowth, only to now again kind of be surrounded by enemies and looking like they could collapse at any moment. It's just, it's so crazy to me. And I mean, that's also the price you pay for trying to expand the way they did and starting fights on so many fronts.
Some hated the Germans, but few, as was the case in Iran, opposed both. After the Weltkrieg, Persia, later recognized internationally as Iran, grew to be another regional nemesis for the Ottoman Empire. Much of Iran's animosity towards imperialist powers was ultimately a matter of national defense. Iran had, after all, long been the target of colonialist machinations by the hands of Britain and Russia. For these European powers, Central Asia was a staging ground for 19th century proxy wars between states, tribes, and regions. The British and Russians engaged in their cloak and dagger play almost gleefully, playing their so-called great game at the cost of all independent nations in Central.
There it is. Again, back to 40K. They're playing the great game. This is, going back to Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. They're all involved. It's chaos all along.
Asia. The age of Russia and Britain was over, however. When the Entente collapsed at the end of the Weltkrieg, British nominal occupation of Iran ceased along with it. This newfound independence laid the groundwork for an Iranian republic, though the path to democracy and stability would be long indeed. By the early 1920s, a long-standing feud between the modernists and conservative nobility in Tehran erupted into a civil war. Two factions squared off to decide the future of the Silk Road Republic: the Shah's German-backed Qajar loyalists and the progressive parliament, the Majlis. Berlin and Constantinople, for once, aligned on the need to prevent a strong Iran and began supporting the Shah's Qajar loyalists. This bitter civil war engulfed Iranian society during much of the 1920s. In the end, the population rallied against the Central Powers and her Qajar lackeys, and a unified front pushed these Ottoman-backed satellites to the western fringes of the country. Despite her victories, Iran was forced to settle or face a direct intervention by Berlin. In the end, the Ottoman Empire secured control of parts of Iranian Azerbaijan and held on to the Arab sheikdoms of Khuzestan. Like the Arabs, Armenians, and Georgians before, such humiliation could never be forgiven. For
How it always
the new
goes.
emergent nations east of the Mediterranean, it was clear that the Central Powers were no hair better than the Entente and their great game a century before. In Iran, democratic elections after the war would eventually give rise to a conservative government. This democratically elected coalition would unfortunately be shattered by a populist coup under Abdol Hussein Temurtash. This revanchist faction leader would later make common cause with other revanchists in the north,
Oh, snap.
Savinkov's motherland party in Russia. As the Central Powers fought among themselves, their enemies only grew stronger. By the second half of the 1930s, the German world order was beset in the West by revolutionary syndicalists, and in the East by revanchist nationalism. While Germany could still claim to hold a strong industrial and technological advantage over her new rivals, the Ottoman Empire held no such luxuries.
Well, yeah, and I mean, German resources could be cut off quite quickly, though, too. Being they're surrounded.
The Sultan's list of mortal enemies was ever growing, and they were outpacing the Sublime Porte's growth, both in military and economy. While each Ottoman neighbor had their own scores to settle with the Sublime Porte, none would challenge the Sultan more openly than the Arab kingdoms to the south. The Egyptian kingdom, after gaining independence in 1925, had taken a jingoist stance against the Ottoman Empire. Cairo had claimed the mantle of defender of the Ummah, the global Islamic movement. Germany would mediate these tensions, but only reluctantly. In truth, the Ottomans could only watch as the Egyptian king built up his forces and began militarizing the Suez area, and, more worryingly, Egypt's Arab alliance. From Riyadh, the seat of Emir Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the Ottomans were watched closely for any sign of weakness. While many weighed their chances against the weak Ottomans, few did as aggressively as the Saudis of Najd and Hassa. Already in 1929, they had taken to raiding Ottoman settlements in Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant to undermine Constantinople's authority in these holdings. Border clashes had become common, though Constantinople was quick to cover up such regional clashes as policing actions. Even more concerningly, the syndicalists of Britain and France had begun showing up in the region as well.
Yeah,
London
I was waiting
and
for
Paris
that.
saw the Ottoman Empire as the weak underbelly of the imperial establishment, and hoped Ottoman demise would fan the flames of their world revolution. French and British actions were
Yeah, I'm sure the syndicalist movement would love to get a holding down there in the Middle East, especially in the Ottoman Empire, if they could, and start some kind of revolution down in there. I don't know how really well it would go throughout the Middle East, though. So many different nations in there and so many different beliefs. I don't know how well of a foothold they'd be able to get, but I mean, if they could get something in the Ottoman Empire, I'm sure that would be big.
Were more subtle than Germany's, but no less damaging. In truth, the syndicalists were not out to convert any of the Arab states to their socialist cause. In the Middle East, the new Internationale instead pursued a policy of anti-colonialism, seeking to actively escalate colonial conflicts to distract the overstretched German Empire.
Interesting.
By the start of the 1930s,
they're essentially just kind of using it as a means to make sure to overstretch German influence, essentially.
Most Arab nations had openly begun contesting Ottoman borders. Unlike during the First Arab Revolt, this uprising was now fully supported by regional Arab powers, with Egypt at the helm. Ambitious religious leaders called for the formation of a great Arab army, an alliance of so-called mujahideen. Germany, long a guarantor of stability in the Arabian hinterlands, was silent. It seemed that in the Arabian matter, the German Kaiser would not take a side. Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria were absorbed by internal politics.
Well, I feel like at that time too, right, there's so much going on, especially with the rise of syndicalism and the British revolt, that they probably have too many other things that they really got to take, like the British revolt, the French, syndicalist movement, and then the unrest in Russia with what's going on there. Like, there's too many other things that they got to pay attention to.
And the British Empire had become a distant memory. In this new world, the Ottoman Empire was alone and surrounded by enemies. The Second Arab Revolt would come. This much had become undeniable. The outstanding questions were simply who would lead the Arab insurrection and when. While all Arab states agreed on the need for Arab liberation, there was much contention as to who would rule these new Arab lands after the dust had settled. Would it be the Wahhabist radicals of Najd and Hassa, the opportunic emir of Jabal Shammar, or would Egypt reclaim her historic seat at the table of power? None played the political game better than the emir of Najd. Not only was Najd geographically isolated from possible partners, but the Arab nation was also tied down by the House of Rashid, a reliable ally of the Ottoman Empire. Feigning loyalty, Najd continued to pay tribute to Constantinople. When the Sultan wasn't looking, however, the Najd leader Abdulaziz ibn Saud spread his radical Wahhabist worldviews to Arabian rebels everywhere. He was not the only Arab leader with ambitions, however. To the north, the emir of Jabal Shammar weighed his options. Their leader, Emir Saud bin Abdulaziz al-Rashid, was keenly aware of his nation's limitations. Historically, the Rashidis and the Ottomans were close allies. In return for securing the Sublime Porte's southern flanks, they were granted the concession of hosting the thousands of pilgrims who passed to the holy Arab cities on foot. With the expansion of the Ottoman railway network, however, pilgrims circumvented the increasingly isolated desert emirate. Jabal Shammar stood at a crossroads. If they supported the Sublime Porte in the coming Arab War, Constantinople might reward them richly. If they rose up, however.
But at the same time, like, they already got bypassed by the railway system, essentially taking any kind of foot traffic that would bring in any kind of boon to their economy. So who's to say that the Ottoman Empire wouldn't just do that again?
They stood to gain in a new Arab-dominated Middle East.
Right. It's definitely a risk-reward situation, but it seems like the reward would probably be greater if they were to oppose the Ottoman Empire, because they could essentially gain more of a level of independence and have more of a say in a united Arab nation.
In the 1930s, all Arab factions embarked upon a militarization campaign that would prepare their armies for a protracted desert war with the Ottoman Empire. During the Weltkrieg, the Ottoman Empire had struggled to hold Arabia against the British and a few scattered Arab revolts. A unified Arab front, then, was quickly becoming the Sultan's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
Veterans from the long insurgency traveled to the preparing Arab nations. This time, war would come at the Sublime Porte from all sides, both from within and outside her borders. Georgia, Armenia,
Doesn't sound
Iran,
good.
Egypt, Greece, Arabia. Constantinople was surrounded by an overwhelming number of enemies, each of which had their own reasons to desire the destruction of the Sublime Porte. Once, the empire of the Osman family stretched from the Caucasus Mountains deep into Africa. By 1936, it had become a waning network of struggling fiefdoms, barely patched together by the vizier Mustafa Kemal. How long could the Turks hold out against the mauling jaws of history? A decade earlier, Constantinople had barely survived the Great War. It was yet to be seen whether she would survive the Desert War to come.
War is coming to Arabia, brother. And this time I am not sure the Ottoman Empire can win. I write you this letter out of desperation. You must convince the Parliament, for I fear our time to act is running out fast. For too long, Constantinople has not seen Cairo as a credible threat. They would rather debate squabbles in the Caucasus, or the latest Greek political theatrics, rather than face the real threat. Egypt has declared herself protector of the Arabian people, and Germany is giving her the weapons it needs to empower that claim. The streets of Cairo are not packed with camels, brother. They are packed with German tanks and artillery. The Emir is adept at hiding this buildup of forces, but my department has seen the requisition reports the Egyptian government hides. Egyptian resources are traded for German cannons, and a third of all the small arms go missing every month. Where do they go? Who is protecting the southern border of our empire? Cousin, this is not a foreign enemy. The agents of Cairo are already inside our own house. I've recommended a preemptive strike in Cairo, but Constantinople will not move. When, not if, the Egyptians inevitably invade, their German equipment will make all the difference.
Yeah.
The Germans won't involve themselves directly in the war, so if you ask me, better to strike first. We still hold the air advantage. If we move now, we could cripple the railroads connecting the front to the Nile Valley. We have a slim chance at victory, but only if we strike. For the love you bear me, brother, heed my words. You are in good standing with Vizier Gamal. Plead with him to see this threat for what it is. Your party has defended Anatolia once, let it do so again. Brother, I ask you to back my case in the Parliament. If you do not act now, I am not sure.
Oh. Too late.
Yes. The tip was good. Tell Rousseau that Cairo appreciates his assistance in this matter. It is a simple thing, really.
I think this is the syndicalist
arrogance.
factions.
The Germans play into our hand eagerly.
Yeah.
That is the problem with imperialists, no? They spend so long surrounded by smiling yes-men, they begin to believe their own infallibility. A man on a high throne sees only kneelers. Chaos is the fire from which we will have our world revolution. Let the scarlet dawn come, comrade. Berlin will find this new world is not so kind to the Kaiserreich.
There you have it, man. Another great video. Kaiserreich Documentary, Episode 7, Crown and Crescent, Ottoman Empire, Middle East, Balkans, and Bulgaria. Another great video. There was a lot that was presented and covered in this video, mostly with the Ottoman Empire. And I mean, it, like I'd said earlier, it really is kind of crazy to me, like how stretched thin the Ottoman Empire pushed themselves, even going to open war with Germany, who was their allies, you know, over the oil fields in I think it was Armenia. But just how stretched thin they were, and then to make it out of the you know, World War I the way they did, with all the various political uprisings that ended up happening, to them to have a big boom in economic resurgence, only to then be surrounded by enemies, with the United Arab Nation uprising, you know, happening, and an Arab, you know, a United Arab invasion getting ready to happen against them. Like, it's pretty crazy how up and down and up and down and up and down history went for the Ottoman Empire during this time in this, you know, timeline. And it's interesting how, you know, as well with the Egypt essentially seeming to be the nation kind of coming to rise and really uniting the various Arab nations, and them seeming to be poised to become a global power in what seems to be the lead towards World War II, you know, and them potentially, you know, again, they're gearing up to invade the Ottoman Empire, and that could spread through up into Europe and down through other parts of Africa and over into, you know, Central Asia. So their influence could spread greatly depending on what's going on, and who knows what kind of alliances would happen coming towards, you know, what would lead up to potentially World War II, because it's more than likely you would think that they would not want to have anything to do with the Germans, being that they had a big hand being allied with the Ottoman Empire against them, you know. So I don't know, lots of just crazy upheaval. First time I've seen this one, very interesting. Didn't know anything about the faction. They have a lot going. Yeah, there's a lot going on with this one. Lots going on. But it also is kind of interesting to me with I forget. I'm like I've said numerous times, I'm bad with names, but his name was brought up here toward the end. The guy who was the kind of the war czar or whatever, who was really kind of in charge of the Ottoman Empire. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Like I said, I'm bad with names. But, you know, he was supposed to be this great tactical war genius, you know, during World War I. And he's the one that held, you know, the Brits, you know, back when they were pushing forward, and essentially broke their advance and any kind of claim they had in the Middle Eastern fronts. Like, you would think he would see this threat to Egypt and want to do something about it, but it might be a situation where, again, they've been stretched so thin because of all the political uprisings happening that they just don't have the resources to do anything about it, and they got to try to, you know, stay on the defensive, I guess, until things actually progress, not try to yeah, come on. So I don't know, it's a very interesting situation with everything that's happening down there. And again, like, because of the need for oil, it surprises me that they had so many different kind of political uprisings and unrest during that time period. You would think someone, because of the resources and importance in oil and with the economic boom that they had, that they would have been able to keep more of a unified front But again, they had so many enemies that they'd made during World War I, and they were essentially surrounded by them, that what really could they do, I guess, you know? So, but another great video by Kaiserreich Cinema. That was Kaiserreich Documentary, Episode 7, Crown and Crescent, Ottoman Empire, Middle East, Balkans, and Bulgaria. Links will be down below, as always, in the description to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to Kaiserreich Cinema's channel. Please do me a favor, if you like this video, go over there and give it a like. And if you've been enjoying this, documentary series so far, then please do me a favor, go over and hit that sub button on this channel. I believe there's only one more episode in this documentary series from him at the moment. This is an ongoing series. So, we'll cover that last one when we can, which is episode 8 is the cycle of Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the Balkans. So we're going to get more into the Balkans and Bulgaria. That one he just put out a few weeks ago, so it'll probably be a while before we get another video in this documentary series from him. But we've had requests to check out videos from other content creators in this Kaiserreich universe, so we'll continue to check out stuff from this universe. And as more videos get put out by Kaiserreich in this series, we will react to them. But that's gonna do it for now, boys. Appreciate you. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider leaving a like and a sub. It helps me and the channel grow. If you've been around the channel for a while and decide you want to take your sport to the next level, we'd love to have you guys come in here and join the discussions. As you can see, we're doing this reaction live right now with my YouTube members. So if you'd like to join, there's a join button underneath the video, as well as a link in the description to the YouTube membership tiers and benefits that I offer. Take a look, see if any of that would have any interest for you, if you decide you want to get your sport to the next level. But yeah, regardless, thank you guys very much. Hope you have a wonderful, safe, and holiday season coming up here. If you're traveling here in the States for Thanksgiving, have safe travels. Enjoy some good food with the families. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Have a wonderful day, everybody.